Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got some really brilliant speakers today. I'm really excited that we have Andy Stainton, who's going to sort of be our master of ceremonies, going to make sure that we're on time. I'll let Andy introduce himself, and I will shut up now. But it's a lovely thing to see so many of you on this webinar, and I will pop up intermittently and see you in a bit. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to everybody who's joined us on this webinar. My name is Andy Stainton, and I've got two hats in connection with Theatre Centre. One is that I'm the education expert for secondary education. I'm the head teacher of Mill Hill County High School in Barnet. And prior to that, way back in my career, I started off as a drama teacher. So the creativity and the arts are very much part and parcel of what I feel is really valuable about education. But also a couple of years ago, I joined Theatre Centre as one of the trustees, and I'm really excited about the way that Theatre Centre is growing its capacity to work with schools across the country, both with programmes like this and with its digital online work. And if you haven't checked it out already, then do have a look on their website for the other programmes that are available. So, sex education. It's one of those things that if you go to a teacher at the beginning of the year and say, right, you've got the sex education topic, they tend to run a mile. And it's also one of those things that if you say to a kid, right, you've got sex education today, the last thing they want to do is hear from their teacher about sex. But the new relationships and sex education programme that has been brought in from September, although it's been delayed officially until the summer term, there should be some rollout in the first two terms, is really vitally important because it brings in the relationships aspect. And we know very much, especially with the pressure from social media, that relationships is something that young people are struggling to cope with more and more. There are so many influences about what a relationship should be like through social media, often which are false. And it's really important that we can engage them in serious conversations about what a healthy relationship is. So the new programme of study isn't just about the biological elements of sex, but it's also about how sex forms part of a strong relationship. It looks at the healthy aspects of those intimate relationships, but it also looks at what a respectful relationship is in the first place, whether it's right to consent when you feel ready, what the pressures are to consent if you're not feeling ready, and those sorts of topics can be really difficult for young people to engage with. So creativity plays a vital part in that because it enables them to empathise with characters who are going through experiences that they may be going through already or may be about to go through. It will enable them to look at scenario choices so that they can see the impact of choices that characters can make and how that will affect the rest of their lives. But it also models those healthy relationships which are really vital for young people as they go into the adult world. So today what you're going to be doing is hearing from a number of panelists who are developing programs of work that will tie into the development of the RSE curriculum. We'll be starting off with two collaborators with Theatre Centre, Charlotte, Josephine and Xana, who are working on our current production, which will roll out across the country over the coming year, Birds and Bees. And then a little while later, you're going to be hearing from Amelia Jenkinson, who is the CEO of the non-profit organisation Sexplain, who will talk us through what she is planning to do with the programmes as we go through and how you can benefit from the work that Sexplain does. So I'm going to hand over now to Charlotte and Xana, who are going to come online, and they will talk you through the next phase.
Hi, thanks Andy. That was such a great introduction. How you doing, Xana? You're right?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. I was just thinking maybe the best way to start is if I introduce myself and how this commission came about, and then ask you to do the same. Does that sound like a good plan? Cool. So I'm Charlotte Josephine. I'm the writer of Birds and Bees. So basically Theatre Centre got in touch a while ago and were interested in working with me on writing a play for young people that would tour schools and venues. And my first thought was like, oh no, because my experience of theatre coming into schools was not a positive one as a kid. Like I hated it. It was really badly done, and I was not a polite audience member. And so the pressure of like getting that right, I was like really attracted to that because I really love theatre and I really love live art, and I feel passionately, like as a person from a working class background, I feel passionately that everybody should have access to that, and I know that that isn't the common thought process about theatre in particular. So a lot of like young people's introduction into theatre is through a company coming to visit them at schools, and if we get it right, it could be like really exciting and mind-blowing for them, and if we get it wrong, it can be an absolute killer. So the pressure's high for me. Like I was like, I want to make a piece of theatre that's like banging, that like excites them and makes them feel empowered, and yeah, that's just exciting basically. And my first thought was that I wanted to write about sex education, because it's a topic that I really care about personally. Like I, again, didn't have a great experience with it at school. I had a real like abstinence program told by a really embarrassed teacher that was kind of blushing their way through like the bare basics of heterosexual sex. There was no talk of emotions or consent or pleasure or any of the kind of inside stuff. All I really remember was the teacher being embarrassed, so I sort of knew that it was something embarrassing, like that sex was something that you don't talk about and is embarrassing. And if I had any questions, I certainly wouldn't go to an adult to talk to them about it. And that has been really damaging for me in my life, and I don't want that to continue. I think sex education can be much more fun basically than it was. So yeah, that was why I wanted to grab this opportunity to write about it, and to ask like all of the difficult questions, because I don't know the answers, but to try and like provoke conversations with young people and their teachers and their parents so that they feel empowered to do that basically. And then Xana got brought on board, who's sick and like so exciting. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit about who you are and what you do and why you're excited to work on this project?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Xana. I intersect across like different types of mediums. I mainly do a lot of writing. I work in sound design, composing. I do a lot of things with young people, and when I got asked to do this show, I was really excited because I've been doing workshops in the past with teenagers about creating space for themselves and how to like be aware of their boundaries and how to be aware of other people's boundaries and how to think of consent as something that it isn't a punishment for anyone. It actually allows you to know what you need and to also be very aware of other people and your position to them. And so for me, it was really great to see that somebody was going to tackle a topic that we weren't actually tackling as open as we could be within schools on a national level, because you could see it in different types of TV shows. When kids go home, like they can kind of see TV shows and characters representing them and talking about it in a free way. But within schools, unless you had a teacher that's really aware, it's really hard to have that conversation happen with the perspective of like there are different genders, there are different sexualities. And at least when I went to school, I went to a Catholic school, so sex very much wasn't about pleasure at all, it was about procreation. And there was definitely a lot of shame, and I wouldn't have asked a teacher in the middle of the class that they were showing us on like how to use sanitary wear and stuff like that. It was very much an embarrassing thing. So there's no way I either would have asked an adult in that room or after leaving that room things that I was curious about myself or to understand actually. And so for me, like, it's really nice to be able to approach a story like this that's about stepping into your self-expression and actually developing your voice and developing where your boundaries sit and understanding what's comfortable for your own body, and how you can also, like, you need to look out for the people around you. And there are things that you don't spot when you're younger, that as you're older and you look back and you're like, oh, I wish I had known that then. And it, yeah, depending on the education or openness you have towards sex, it can happen really early and in a really safe and wonderful environment, or it can happen later on in life when you're an adult and you're picking up all of these things later. Yeah, so for me, being able to combine what I use with live looping and freestyling and this very open way of making music, of making stories, fits so well with sex, because it isn't just one path or one approach to looking at sex or sexual identity or gender. There are so many different ways. And that's why it's nice to like work on a story like this, because the characters aren't all the same. The characters all don't have the same level of like power or access. And I think that's really important, because it's changing how kids are in school today and how they're able to express themselves in ways that maybe a lot of the people in this call weren't able to when they were at school. And that's why this is like really exciting, because yeah, you can incorporate and you can be, I think, a bit more in the face about the characters and the real experiences that they go through, and particularly like bringing in the aspects of being online and stuff. Like this is, yeah, it's a really great place to from theatre wise.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a thing that you were talking about there, like the complexities of how different individual experiences can be, and like embracing the nuances and how messy it is, like is something that I feel like collectively we're doing with this piece. And Rob, the director, is really encouraging me to embrace how messy it is. Like it's complicated, because really when you're talking about sex, you're talking about fear and power and communication and trust and respect and pleasure, and all of those things are nuanced and complicated, and none of it's black and white and neat. And so it makes sense to, like, what I love about your work is that it's really detailed and nuanced in different layers of sound, but it can create something that's complex and that's contradicting itself. And I feel like the young people I've met recently are contradicting themselves all the time. They seem to really embrace that, how messy humans are. So I guess like a little bit about the show, and then maybe you could talk more, Xana, about what you're developing sound wise, if you want to. So for those that don't know, you don't have to. For those that don't know, like, so yeah, the play Birds and Bees, like there's 4 characters in it that are stuck in a detention, and there's been a case of sexting that's happened between 2 characters that are not on stage, and we get to explore their individual reactions to it. So there's Aaron, who's like a young, cheeky, chappy, kind of like very likable, like football lad. There's Billy, who's a queer, non-binary character that appears very confident in themselves, but has got a lot of stuff that they're still working out. There's Maisie, who is a young woman that's not actually that interested in sex at the moment, and is just much more interested in her studies and her academic focus, and is a bit like, why is everyone talking about sex all the time? And then there's Layla, who is dating Aaron and is best friends with Sherelle, who was involved in the sexting, and she's kind of really like obsessed with Instagram and that whole lifestyle of documenting herself online, and it really exploring the fine line between what can be a beautiful self-expression and what can start to become toxic. So there's a lot going on basically, and it kind of pokes at lots of areas but doesn't try and answer all of the questions. And I think what's great about it is hopefully the students watching it will then be able to talk about the characters with their teachers rather than talking about themselves. It will allow them like a little buffer space between themselves and the characters. So rather than having to say, oh, I'm scared about this, or I'm struggling with this, they'll be able to say, oh, it's interesting that that character did that. But because it's 2020, we're not just doing like a straight play. So the style of it's going to be a little bit more explorative and like, I can't think of a better word than that really, like a bit modern and abstract in places, and that's where like the sound design and the set design comes into that. I don't know if you got anything that you want to jump in on.
Yeah, like, I was thinking about what you were saying about how it is complex actually, and I think like working with young people, they have so many layers and there are so many different changes all happening at once, and I think the music tries to illustrate that, because 1 minute everything feels calm and the next minute it just sounds extreme, and then it's an explosion of spoken words, and then it's an explosion of rap or just natural sound from the world around them, or it's beats, and it's all a combination of things, because we're complicated, because we're not homogenous. We have so many different ways of expressing ourselves, and we'll continue to change those ways in which we express ourselves. And I think sometimes, often when you're growing up, you're kind of told to work towards being a fixed shape, and that there's an inflexibility when you become an adult, and actually you need to have room to be able to try different things, to have things that you're so sure about when you're 15, and then you've changed your mind by the time you're 16 years old, and then you go back to it when you're 20, and then it comes back again. Like, that's the process of like just growing up and seeing that there are things within your taste that you don't like. And I think within music as well, that's what I tried to explore, particularly when we were in the R&D, is encouraging the actors to be like, think of the character that you're playing, but think of the world that they exist in and the world that they've built around themselves to kind of be able to get up in the morning, go to school. Maybe the household that they live in is really difficult, so there's also that kind of mental maintenance they have to do for themselves whilst they go home, or whilst they're at home, or being in the house. And I try to get them to think about the kind of music that their character would be listening to, and how sometimes that music gets interrupted by the real world, or gets interrupted by anxiety, or gets interrupted by the responsibility of having to make a decision that feels so great, like the sexting situation, where you're now suddenly thrust into a thing of, this feels like a very adult thing to do, and I don't even know how to approach this, and there's not enough information on the best way of doing this. So some of them ignore it, or some of them lean into it and make it worse. And that's what you do, you really make mistakes. And that's what I love within the looping, is that it doesn't try to pretend those mistakes don't exist, that there isn't something that's offbeat. In fact, you can include that in it, because we're not infallible. And I think especially when you're exploring your sexuality and you're exploring pleasure, you need that space to be able to be like, I didn't know what I liked, I didn't know how to say something, and like now you have the space to kind of explore with it. And yeah, and I think with the music and with the words as well, there's a really lovely relationship that the words are able to deliver, where they sometimes cut off, or characters almost seem like they're making music out of the words themselves, which I think is really wonderful, because it brings it together in a really nice relationship, so to speak.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, just to finish up, so we've just had an R&D, which is research and development. So it's a period of time with some actors, the director, Xana, and a few other people in the room, exploring the text, working, for me as the writer, hearing it out loud and working out what's working and what's not working. And a big part of that was that some teachers and some students came on the last day and watched a read through of the script and were able to give us some feedback, which was really vital for me, because I don't want this piece to be students against teachers or young people against adults. It's all of us together, and trying to find ways of I just think it must be, I've got so much respect for teachers, mad respect, because I just think it's so hard, and the work that you're doing is powerful, and yet there isn't enough support for teachers having these difficult conversations. I think that's the main thing that I've learned so far about the script, is I thought I was writing about sex education, but actually I'm writing about how to have honest conversations, and how difficult that can be sometimes, and how we're not really taught how to think critically or have honest conversations with people, or have difficult conversations, especially with someone who's got a very different opinion or political view to ours. So yeah, it's become a bit more of a exploration of like, how do we have a difficult conversation? Why is this so hard? Like, why?
I think maybe a part of it is because we're not really taught conflict, the conflict that we have with each other and the conflict that we have within ourselves, how to resolve that. So it's very much like push it down. And if you're not really having an honest conversation with yourself, how can you be put in an environment where the teachers are not also being encouraged to be able to give you the tools to have honest conversations in the classroom? Because it is a really difficult position to be in when you're faced with like different kids with different backgrounds, and you want to be able to encourage it, but you're also stuck within certain parameters. So it is a thing of like how to gain the necessary honesty that it feels empowering, I guess, for everybody in the room.
It's vulnerable and it's tricky, and like it would be wonderful if it felt empowering for everyone in the room, if everyone felt safe enough to dive in to the messiness of it and to have a bit more fun with it. I think would be a beautiful thing. And I think that's us on time.
Okay, thank you both. A really interesting conversation, and I think the important thing there is it doesn't matter how young you are in your teaching career. The fact that this has gone through research and development, talking to teenagers today, is absolutely vital, because in a few years, social media, technology changes that whole relationship that young people have with each other and with sex and relationships. And so it would be false for us to try and overlay our experiences onto them. And we're really excited about what Birds and Bees is going to do. It will be touring, hopefully, as lockdown eases across the country. So do have a look at the website to find out more information about how you can book. But Charlotte and Xana, thank you very much for your time today. Interestingly and rather spookily, as they were talking, the DFE just pushed through a promotion about relationships and sex education that needs to be launched in September. So they're obviously listening in as well. It's a new opportunity, I think, to reframe that conversation, as I say, about relationships. But our next speaker, Amelia, I'm really excited to hear about and hear the work that she is leading on Sexplain and how that's going to be important for us as we take this conversation forwards. Amelia.
Thank you, Andy. I've prepared a few slides, so I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, as you heard, my name is Amelia. I'm from Sexplain. My pronouns are she, her. And I wanted to talk a bit today about the transformative potential of RSE, which I think has already been very kind of eloquently summed up by Charlie and Xana there. But to explain first a little bit about who we are. Sorry, I'm just trying to skip to the next slide. My computer doesn't seem to be playing along. Just do it like that instead. So Sexplain is a non-profit, as you've heard. We provide award-winning RSE programs. These are primarily workshops delivered by our unembarrassable team of external sexperts in schools. Our approach is LGBTQIA+ inclusive. So historically, again, as you've kind of heard a bit about people's experiences of RSE, RSE has historically been very kind of heteronormative. So it's either implicitly or explicitly suggested that all sex and relationships are between kind of a man with a penis and a woman with a vagina. So kind of haven't been inclusive. We're a sex positive organisation, and what we mean by that is we take a kind of positive view of human sexuality and promote kind of choice and people making choices according to kind of them as individuals. Our approach is evidence-based, so we work with universities and experts in the medical profession, in education and various other RSE fields. Because of a lack of resources around relationships and sex education, often, especially in an age of kind of internet misinformation and fake news, young people aren't able to access the rigorously evidence-based information that they deserve. We also provide training for staff and collaborate on a number of initial teacher training programs, including a PGCE course at UCL. We work with university students. We have some free online resources that we've actually specifically created during COVID for students to complete independently and from home. And we feed into various bits of policy and research projects, including working with the Department for Education on their new training modules around the RSE curriculum. So yeah, we're the opposite of the Mean Girls guy, whose quote I've got up here, who famously said, "Don't have sex because you will get pregnant and die." So I wanted to first look at the kind of negative impacts of having a sort of low quality or lack of RSE. Thank you, Rob, for your lol comment there. So I put that quote up, and I think this show really kind of satirized the sort of abstinence-based RSE, which I think is something that the Netflix series Sex Education also did recently with, for anyone who's seen it, that kind of head teacher character, most kind of notably the assembly about the nude that gets shared around, and there's the kind of "it's my vagina," fairly subversive kind of ending to that episode for anyone who's seen it. But the impact of this approach is fairly enormous. So I've summed up some of the features that may be encompassed in this Mean Girls approach, but I think just generally everyone's kind of experience of relationships and sex education broadly. So historically, RSE, if you were kind of lucky enough to get any at all, might have suggested that relationships are only between a man with a penis and a woman with a vagina, as is sex, and sex just being something about kind of reproduction, making babies. The idea that kind of sexual health is shameful, it should be kind of kept secretive. The idea of STIs as something dirty or a suggestion that someone's promiscuous. Pleasure and masturbation being taboo and not being things that we should speak openly about. Not kind of being willing to talk about the genitalia, parts of the body, or sex relationships openly at all. Lots of misconceptions around consent, including that the only way, you know, unless someone's kind of screaming stop and kicking someone, they're otherwise consenting, and the ideas around kind of marriage and holding the nuclear family up on a pedestal. I guess if you just think for a moment about those statements and the impact that they have on someone's life, which I think we've already heard about, you can tell the impact, like I say, is fairly enormous. And whilst sex and relationships and all the things that encompass, exactly like Xana and Charlie have just said, that would encompass kind of navigating difficult conversations, being able to be vulnerable, being able to like openly and honestly communicate, empathy, all of those skills that encompasses make up a huge proportion of our lives as human beings, and yet so far have been afforded little or no time in our education. So in terms of the impact of this on our lives, Sexplain essentially exists because more than half of LGBT young people are bullied for being LGBT at school. So that's Stonewall's school report, which they regularly publish in collaboration with Cambridge University, and also publish similar reports for workplaces and universities as well. So I definitely encourage looking at those for the sort of latest evidence around LGBT kind of rights and experiences. More than 1/3 of young people still think that carrying protection is a sign that someone's promiscuous. 41% of UK girls aged 14 to 17 who reported an intimate relationship experienced some form of sexual violence from their partner. As you may know, the Women and Equalities Committee did a big inquiry into sexual harassment and sexual violence in schools, and this was one of their key findings from that. More than 1/4 of people who menstruate report that they didn't know what to do when they started their periods, and nearly half of children in the UK aged 14 to 21 who menstruate are embarrassed by their periods. Some more kind of facts and figures around the impact of low quality or uninclusive RSE would be, out of the 30,000 young people that Sexplain has worked with, only a handful knew the word vulva, so just that kind of basic knowledge of knowing the proper names for parts of our anatomy. Obviously until we taught them. We do kind of Play-Doh genital modelling to help bust some of these taboos and provide the necessary education, which is really important, just the sort of facts of life, but also for safeguarding purposes as well. The majority of people have correctly identified the clitoris, which is a really important kind of source of pleasure for people with vulvas and vaginas. There's a little diagram of a clitoris on the left there. And we recently did a research project around teen digital sexual cultures, and one of our findings was that 3/4 of girls had received unsolicited dick pics via social media, which we would sort of conceptualize as a form of digital sexual harassment. But because of the normalization of these behaviors amongst young people and the widespread nature of them, lots of students wouldn't kind of recognize this as a form of harassment. And I guess examples that we've just heard about, like sexting and someone having their images shared without consent, being kind of a form of abuse as well. Students don't often recognize that that's the case. On the flip side then, if we do have a comprehensive kind of rights-based inclusive RSE, we can have kind of a truly transformative effect. So this type of RSE might include themes like consent, ethical decision-making, healthy relationships, gender, power, equality and rights, how to stay healthy, and identity. And it's vital that we think beyond what we've seen in RSE so far, and we consider the way in which these themes could change people's lives across school, but also wider society. So if we start to apply these themes to a whole school approach and a whole society approach, we do find that we need to kind of start to rethink the way we do certain things as well. So through this form of inclusive, rights-based, ethics-based relationships and sex education, not only can we start to unpick some of those harmful attitudes and behaviours that I described before, which, as we've kind of already discussed, have a huge impact on many, many aspects of our lives, but we might also start to think that we need to rethink the way in which we have been doing certain things. So questions that may arise might be, do we actually need student consultations in order for RSE to be inclusive for everyone, and in order for us as a school to kind of role model equality and kind of seeking students' consent? Maybe processes like that might be important. Is there a kind of social justice project that a student is clearly really passionately about? Do we need to make sure that we properly resource that and properly support them, and put several systems in place to ensure we integrate that kind of rights and ethics-based lens into all aspects of our school practice? Do we have like a gendered uniform policy? Does that need to be changed? What's the best way that we can do that? Again, kind of role modeling these behaviours that we talk about in RSE. So I guess thinking, which I think Birds and Bees also aims to do, beyond just RSE as like a messy fit, as a one-off lesson that's maybe delivered by someone who, like historically, as we've kind of heard, might feel a bit embarrassed doing it. We open up really kind of exciting potentials for the impact of RSE if we start to think about it in this new way. If you'd like to kind of find out more about what Sexplain does or ask any questions, I've put my email on there, but otherwise I think I am out of time. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and thank you very much.
Great.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
I think one of the things that you sort of touched on at the end there, Amelia, was the importance of training, and that the training that's applied to teachers who are going to be delivering this program is going to be really essential. And so there's aspects of that we can think about as well. Just to remind you, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. If you do have any questions, can you please put them onto the Q&A? And then I'm going to hand over to Rob now, who's going to lead us through the next section.
Thanks, Andy, and Xana, and Charlotte, and Amelia. That's great. Really brilliant stuff. As I said, if this the Q&A button, so please do put those in. Otherwise, this is going to be a very short section, or I'm going to make up questions. So that's going to be interesting. I don't think I introduced myself at the beginning, so apologies for that. My name is Rob. I am the Artistic Director of Theatre Centre. and director of Birds and Bees. And Theatre Centre has been around for nearly 70 years. We're a new writing company taking work into schools. And over those 70 years, we've taken into schools stories that are meant to be complicated and crunchy and difficult to answer. And really, our job is to be useful. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end in terms of how we can be useful to you as teachers. There's very much that Sexplain. You can see how useful that is in terms of really opening up conversations, which is great. I'll talk more about that. So there's a couple of questions that are coming through. Amelia, there was one question from Rebecca who was asking about whether those slides were available for people at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to share them.
Fantastic. So what we'll do is Amelia, if you send them to me, and then we'll send them out as part of the end email that we send to everyone. That'd be great. We've got a question from Jenny Johnson asking about whether Sexplain workshops are suitable for primary schools as well as secondary.
Yes, we do work with primary and also alternative provision as well. So yeah, do get in touch. And because all schools obviously have slightly different needs in terms of the curriculum that's provided internally, the timetable, etc. We're happy to kind of put together bespoke programs according to specific requirements.
Amazing, fantastic. I'm going to open that conversation up. There's a brilliant question from Laura, which talks a bit more about primary schools. About, do we have any advice for primary schools? We're keen to tackle difficult issues before they come up, but want to be careful and sensitive. I wonder, Amelia, just from your experience, what type of conversations you're having within primary schools and what advice you could give.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of key things that's often covered around year 5 and 6 is puberty, and I guess there's been a bit of discussion recently in light of the new RSE guidance about what sort of information to cover here. I guess just based on the statistics I just gave, the importance of covering kind of menstruation for all students, ideally like dividing students by gender, covering kind of correct names for parts of the body and anatomy, and normalizing terms like vulva and different parts of the anatomy from an early age, which I then think links into another kind of question that we've got here about working with students who have a lot of internalized shame. And I think actually we can remove that shame by having those conversations early. So yeah, the importance of kind of correct terms also for the safeguarding reasons, like I mentioned before. And then introducing the concept of consent as well. And obviously at a primary school level, that looks more like kind of the NSPCC pants rules is, I'm sure, something that a lot of people use. But those ideas of kind of good versus bad, touching, or like appropriate, inappropriate, that like appropriate touching should make us feel like safe, warm, loved. Inappropriate might make us feel like weird, anxious, where we can then go to kind of seek help if we need it. And another kind of aspect of the new RSE guidance is again that LGBT inclusivity. So ensuring that when we're talking about kind of families, we talk about that in a really inclusive way and use really kind of inclusive examples. Obviously, there's kind of books and things that that would mean that could be echoed across different aspects of like of school life as well.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. There's a question around, is Birds and Bees aimed at a specific year group or key stage? Yes, we are looking at, it's a 14 plus currently, but there is a conversation whether if you're wanting a slightly younger year group, we can have a conversation with you about the content, but we have geared it towards a 14 to 16 age group. It's also what the age of the characters are. The characters are sort of 16, and yeah, so we can have conversations about that. Just talking about the LGBTQ plus element of that. Charlotte, I don't know whether you want to talk about Billy it was really clear for us to have a character who identified as queer. And also like our journey of that character, maybe it could be an interesting thing, so that it's important how they are in the world, that we're not creating a story that is idealized. We have Charlotte has created a story that feels real, that feels like that queer character is isolated. I'm not answering for you there. I just wondered whether you could talk a bit more about Billy in this, and how we can use that then to sort of talk to how young people then could relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm non-binary and queer, and so it felt weird to write a story that didn't have a character that also was. But then I was like nervous about it because I don't know, internalized homophobia, I guess. But I was like, oh, should I, shouldn't I, should I, like, and because it's such a big topic, it was hard to cover everything without covering everything. And we spoke about that balance, didn't we, for a while? And then we spoke about both queer and trans and gay characters often are like the storyline for them is often a trauma-based one, or like a coming out story, and we really wanted to avoid that as much as possible. So Billy's like quite joyful in themselves most of the time, and seems quite comfortable in their own skin, as much as a 16-year-old can be, I think. And it's more like the other characters' reactions to them, that their queerness isn't an integral part of the story, but it is an integral part of who they are, if that makes sense. So Aaron has a lot of like questions and confusion about masculinity, but actually Billy teases out in Aaron a new understanding of his masculinity. And the same with Maisie as well. She seems really baffled about Billy's sexuality. Often that happens with trans characters, that they are completely sexless, and Maisie, and actually Billy's like quite cheeky and seems to be having a great time. So that was quite fun for Maisie to be like, oh, like people like seem to fancy you, and like, what's this all about? Does that answer sort of what you were hoping I was going to say, Rob?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's perfect. And I think for me that, because Billy is a complex and brilliant character, as the other characters are, it enables teachers to be able to sort of unpick and talk about that in some ways a real sense, rather than sort of an abstracted, non-narrative based, and that you've got characters to talk about and that you sort of get to know. One thing just to mention is that as part of the package that Birds and Bees has, is that what we don't do is just land a show in your school and then say, good luck, thanks a lot. We are going to be offering, we've got 18 lesson plans, which are 6 for drama, 6 for English, and 6 for PSHE, that will be made with teachers to look at unpicking and the questions and creative exercises, so that I haven't been a teacher before, but I've worked in schools before, and you teachers, I have the utmost respect for. So those lesson plans are there to sort of really, really help you navigate really like crunchy conversations. We're going to make them in consultation with teachers. Lots of questions coming through. Jude has asked a very specific question around female genital mutilation is a worrying staff in primary schools. Can anyone signpost us to support with covering it, please? Amelia, I don't know if you have any information about that. We may not have the expertise on this panel to signpost, but Amelia, you seem like the best place to answer that.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of specific organisations that provide kind of FGM resources for primaries, I don't know any off the top of my head, but can do a bit of research and ask around. But otherwise, in terms of looking for kind of quality guidance, one that I'm sure that you're already aware of is the NSPCC FGM resources. And then another would be the FGM charity Daughters of Eve, which just contains things like, which would probably be more appropriate for staff when kind of planning something around kind of FGM for primary age. But in terms of phrasing for like why FGM takes place and just some of the kind of background information that could be useful. And then I suppose, and again, I'm sure this is something that you're already doing, but going back to those kind of NSPCC pants rules for the key messages of kind of seeking help and safeguarding would obviously link into it as well. But I can do some further research and see if there are any specific organisations that offer support in that regard and let you know.
Great. Jane has just said on the Q&As that NSPCC does have an FGM helpline. So I'm assuming that's something that teachers can phone up on and get advice through that as well, which is brilliant. So thank you for that, Jane. Tony has asked a particular question around some pupils are sexual abuse survivors. Are there any resources that you can recommend that can help these young people? As a school, we have a very good provision for SRE. This is our area of weakness. Sometimes survivors opt out of these lessons due to them being triggered, so they miss out. Obviously, their education in this area needs to be much more sensitively done. Again, Amelia, I'm sort of, I don't know, Andy, if you have any areas of sort of thought on this, but I'll sort of hand over to you. Again, if you can't answer, that's fine. We can find some other resources if needs be.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't help you on this one. It would need to do a bit of research to find things that are appropriate, age appropriate around the sensitivity of that topic. So I think it would be age dependent as well.
Great.
One organisation, and I need to check what information is out there by them, is My Body Back, which is specifically for sexual abuse survivors. It's run by Pavan Amara, who now runs clinics for people who've experienced kind of sexual violence and might need some kind of medical intervention that could be kind of traumatic for them. But I think that they'll have additional resources on there as well. We also were working with a filmmaker who was a sexual violence survivor and was talking about, again, the idea of kind of reclaiming like pleasure as a kind of recovery process, which I guess links into kind of the importance of self-care. So I wonder whether it sounds like you've got a kind of comprehensive curriculum already, but the sort of self-care element of it might be helpful to stress. But I think they've also created a zine, which may just have some kind of other ways of sort of framing the situation for teachers who are working with those students, which I can provide as well.
Great. The thing that we will do with this is that we'll, in the email, the follow-up email that we send to you, what we'll do is we'll compile some of these websites so that they're all, so all the websites that we've mentioned, we'll make sure that they go into that email to everyone, which is great. So NSPCC does have, I'm going through these now. Jane also talked about Forward and Karma Nirvana. Does that, yeah, again, we'll make sure that those go on to things, Forward UK. Great, fantastic.
There's just a question there, Rob, about funding that somebody has put in. Probably very difficult to get hold of funding, specifically for this from outside charities, but you will be hitting the ground running now if you approach your senior management team, because this is a curriculum that everybody has to roll out and there has to be an investment in it to make it work. So what I would do is approach them really quickly and see if you can get the funding for Birds and Bees to come around to you.
And I think the thing, I can speak specifically for Birds and Bees, and then maybe Amelia talking about your experience of being in schools and funding it for Sexplain. But for Birds and Bees, we cut across drama, English and PHSE. So, and again, I don't know how budgets work in schools, but it feels to me that there's 3 departments there that could, what we're trying to do, make sure is that the price point is really clear as well. More information about that in a second, but and also that we will be supplying those lesson plans for free as part of the package. So it also means that there's a clear, like the resource then becomes, it's not just bringing in a show, for example. Amelia, I don't know if you've had experience of how schools have been able to sort of fund for your work to come in.
Again, I think really varies from school to school, as you say, Rob, but we have a tiered pricing system in terms of independent schools and state schools, and like ultimately aim to make sure that our work is accessible to all schools, and have some university funding as well. and some of it for next academic year will be specifically around sort of digital issues like the online sexual harassment. So yeah, if that's kind of interest to anyone, then that's funded by Leicester University and Anglia Ruskin, who we work with. But yeah, I think like similarly to Birds and Bees, making sure that it's kind of accessible to everyone.
There's a question that was in the chat function, which Amelia, you did touch on, which was from I'm hoping I'm saying your name right, Alvin. Apologies if I have said that incorrectly. About how, like, advice for working with students who've got a lot of internalized shame, embarrassment, talking about sex and relationship and consent. And for me, this is exactly why. For me, this is what theatre. I'll talk specifically about theatre for me, but this is what theatre can do. And is that there is a really, we've all experienced where we can come into school the next day and talk about that show that we saw on TV or Netflix and talk about those characters and what they did and our opinion about what they did and why they did it. And we can talk about all those things, and it's a very safe space to be able to talk about those characters because, one, they don't really exist, but we believe that they do. And also we don't talk about ourselves. And in my experience of that type of work, is that it becomes a very empowering moment where a young person can talk about a character in a really open and messy way without having to sort of expose their feelings. And generally, in my experience, is that they will talk about themselves through that character. They just won't necessarily know that. They might do. But by doing that, we can then talk about pleasure and consent and shame, but it's all about them. It's not about us. And by doing that, it opens up the conversation. So, Elvin, your question really just digs into the root of why we do what we do. Is essentially that it enables us to be able to have conversations that we wouldn't normally have. And for me, that's the powerful and the reason why. Theatre. I used to work at the National Theatre. And my work at Theatre Centre is so much more powerful and useful and interesting, and what I believe theatre should be, than going and seeing a show. You know, we should be like a library. We should be like a doctor's surgery. It should be as useful as that. And to do that, we just need to keep listening. So, you know, we're always trying to improve the work that we do and how it lands. So that's sort of, anyway, it wasn't meant to be a ramble or a rant, but it turned out to be.
Rob, just to add to that, just a note of caution for colleagues, when you're opening up those conversations, just make sure there's a support network around the production as well, because there may be students who want to talk one-to-one afterwards, and if there's nowhere to go, then that can be dangerous.
Absolutely. I think, yes. I think that, again, we will be making sure that the resource is clear about how, you know, obviously there's child protection conversations and issues and all those other bits and pieces. And again, you'll be the experts of how that's set up within your school, but we're aware about, it's exactly right, Andy, it's about making sure that you've got a support network. Kate has asked a very brilliant question because it leads me on to what Birds and Bees is about. So when we're a theatre company, we're a live, we make live work. We're in a pandemic, which we hadn't, of course, realised, and the theatre world and the school world and the academic world is sort of in a very confused place for a variety of reasons, mainly the government, but we won't talk about that. So we're really in consultation with lots of teachers and with all the guidelines that are out there. We're very clear that we, of course, can't tour this show safely or brilliantly. So what we are going to do is that we're going to embark on a really exciting prospect of making a film. So it will be a sort of a hybrid between a live performance and a short film, which we're really excited about. Our endeavour will be to make a live show probably post-Easter next year, if we are out of lockdown or whatever the world is at that point. But in the interim, we'll be making a film. So it means that you can use it as you want, as flexibly as you want. It means that if your school is open or is closed, it means that students are still going to be able to access it. Again, there's conversations around safety and making sure that young people, that you're doing it in a brilliant way. And also, as I said, we're going to be making sure that you've got access to these lesson plans. So it means that there's a really clear teaching plan around it. and there'll be a short documentary with sort of like interviews with creatives to sort of talk about how we made it as well. And if you want, there is a chance to have a live Zoom workshop with our actors as well. It feels like a sales pitch, this. It's not meant to be. I'm just telling you the package. So we were planning to do a live tour of it starting in September. We know, after having conversations with lots of teachers, that's just not going to be possible. As Kate said, you're going to be in particular bubbles, in year groups. Certain places are going to lock down, you know, the risk of an actor coming in from a high risk, anyway, blah, blah, blah. It's all complicated. So we're going to make it simple. We will be making a DVD. So if you're interested in that, then in the feedback form that we're about to send, then you can reference your interests, and we'll be opening bookings at the beginning of August. So we can, yeah, it will be as flexible and as brilliant as we can make it for you. So I hope that answers your question, Kate. Panel, are there any questions that you have, or anything that you want to say? Mainly because I just need to find a link while you're doing that, and then we can we're near enough ready to close. Charlotte.
I could mention some resources if that's helpful, Rob.
Of course, yeah. Amelia, go for
it. So we've, again, funded by various universities, launched a few new resources recently that are all free and on our website. And some of them are actually online sexual harassment guidance documents, a sample policy and a guidance document for students. So particularly if you do kind of use the birds and bees performance, and that might be a really useful resource to kind of supplement some of the themes that arise from that, including things like digital defence and like e-safety platforms, and understanding kind of the law and rights around image sharing as well. So that's under the policy and guidance section on our website. And then we've also got some teachable moments documents, which were designed for students to complete independently from home, but I think could be adapted for lesson use as well. Again, they're all free, and I think pick up on that kind of distancing technique that has been mentioned in terms of like taking a like Netflix, BBC iPlayer, like sex education, noughts and crosses, etc. show, and then providing some kind of prompt questions and discussion points, which could be helpful for tutor times, RSE, etc.
I'm muted. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amelia. Charlotte, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I don't know if it's too big a question, really, considering we're at the very end, but I just wondered really for Andy, like, if you could maybe briefly talk about kind of from top down, like government to schools. Like, I'm a bit baffled as to why the government isn't supporting schools more, and like why schools are having to find funding for external companies. That it's amazing that Sexplain and Theatre Centre exist, but I'm just sat here feeling a bit frustrated for schools. Is that too big a question to ask? What's going on with the government?
It's a huge question, and I wish I knew what was going on with the government. You know, schools have been underfunded for 10 years now, 8% cut in real terms. There are extra pots of money that appear, but generally it's taken away with another hand at the same time. So we have to make do with what we've got. But yeah, that's one for DFE, that one, I think, Charlotte.
We'll get a lobbying group together, Charlotte. It'd be great. We'll be fine. So, folks, we've come to the end. Andy, thank you so much for guiding us through. Xana, Charlie, thank you so much for eloquently talking about birds and bees and your practice. Really brilliant. And Amelia, what a wonderful, brilliant program that you run. I wish that I had that when I was at school. Essentially, I think my life would have been a lot less complicated, I think, if I'd had that. So really, really brilliant. Thank you all for attending as well. We have a feedback form. We're looking to do some more of these, and we want to know what, as I said, we want to be useful. So in that feedback form, that does two things. One, we'll get a sense of what you thought of this, in confidence. 2, it will help us build more of these types of free resources for you and or conversations. I said there was only 2, there's 3. And thirdly, if you are interested in booking Birds and Bees, then you can do that within that. There'll be an email that gets sent round with the Sexplain website and the resources that we spoke about. All I have to say is thank you very much to our speakers and have a great evening, folks. Thanks.